Hi, this is so basically 411 here, coming straight out of Boise, back at you with another crazy conspiracy video. In this week's crazy conspiracy video, we're going to be talking about how the Nazis have a secret base hidden in Antarctica, and pretty much we're going to be debunking it and why this is all bullcrap. We're going to be starting from kind of the start of the conspiracy, and we're going to be going all the way down to that crazy rumored uh, U.S. operation known as Operation High Jump. And we're just going to be discussing why, pretty much, why it's all bullcrap. So I'm going to add some context before I actually get into the conspiracy theory and essentially explain some of the history behind it. Like, for example, I'm going to briefly go over essentially why Germany was so interested in the Antarctic in the first place. So their interest in the Antarctic started in the 1930s. Essentially, what was happening is they were looking for strategic points. So they thought it would be smart enough to pretty much have a point in the Antarctic. Also, another reason why too they essentially launched expedition was they wanted to test the polar conditions on their aircraft. So they wanted to pretty much see, okay, how extreme conditions affect their aircraft, which they actually ended up using some of that information when they ended up fighting the Soviets a couple years later. But really, the huge reason why that they were in the Arctic in the first place, or Antarctic, sorry, I didn't mean to um, mess that up, is because essentially one of their industries that was that they relied heavily on was whaling. Essentially, what they did was they would go whaling and they would use the oil and other parts of the whale to make basically war materials, such as explosives and just in general. Whaling was still really huge back in this time because, as I said, they used it for a lot of stuff. And essentially, what was happening was they were having issues with Britain not taxing them, but putting levies on them, high levies. So they're like, hey, we need to figure a way to be able to go whaling without losing a lot of money. And essentially, what their thought process was to go to the Antarctic, essentially set up a whaling base. So they ended up launching a expedition in the late 1930s. And the area in which the Nazis were exploring was known as Dronning Maudland. I'm probably mispronouncing it incorrectly. First, this place had been discovered by the Norwegians, though they did not officially claim it, but they tried to claim it. And the Nazis came in and said, okay, we're claiming this area. This is our area. And what happened was, before they could start a base there, the Second World War started, which pretty much prevented them from having their own Antarctic whaling Nazi base. Now, where the conspiracy theory starts is in 1945, 2 months after the Germans surrendered to the Allies and the fall of Berlin had occurred. What had happened was two random Joe Blow German U-boats, U-boat 530 and U-boat 977, ended up showing up in Argentina. The reason why that they ended up showing up in Argentina was, at the time, parts of South America and Argentina were sympathetic to the Nazis that were fleeing Europe in order to basically prevent them from being tried. And what had happened was conspiracy theory circles got a hold of this information, and they essentially started spreading the fact that before the German U-boats ended up in Argentina, they had gone to Antarctica and had dropped off Nazi officials there, including Hitler reportedly, and also Nazi treasures. And that essentially what happened was the Nazis started this base there where they were working on advanced technology and weaponry, and how they were essentially completing what they were trying to do in Germany. And what had happened was, over the course of the years, Great Britain, starting with Great Britain, tried to go to this Nazi base and essentially destroy it. They failed miserably, but we're not necessarily going to go into that aspect of it. We're mainly going to focus on the American part. But what ended up happening was, in 1946 through 1947, the U.S. launched Operation High Jump, in which case what the supposed rumor that they started this operation was to go to the Nazi base and destroy it. Well, what ended up happening was they ended up finding the base and attempted to destroy it, but were met with heavy resistance from Nazi artillery and also essentially Nazi advanced weaponry, including the reported Foo Fighters, which were UFOs that the Nazis had built and had apparently used against the Allies during World War II. Now, at the alleged defeat of the US, this is where the conspiracy theory, I guess, branches off into two other stories. One of them being, I guess, a solution to the conspiracy theory and pretty much ending it, the Nazis getting defeated, and then the second aspect, which is continuation. So the conclusion one is the fact that eventually the US launched 3 atomic bombs at the Nazi base, destroying it, killing all the Nazis, pretty much ending the conspiracy theory right there. And then the continuation, I guess, road that a lot of people take is that eventually the Nazis survived and they ended up taking over the whole entire world, and essentially they're running everything behind the scenes. And that's pretty much the conspiracy theory in a nutshell. So the first part of this conspiracy theory that we're going to debunk is the U-boats and how they supposedly went to Antarctica before they ended up showing up in Argentina. So if they were at a Nazi base in the first place, why would they go to Argentina? It makes absolutely no sense to me. I think you could easily make an argument that at the time it really wasn't safe being a Nazi and pretty much everybody in the whole world was hunting for you. So why would you go from a safe place, a place where, you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about getting hunted, to going to Argentina where you would have to face possibly like getting captured, which is actually what initially happened to the 2 U-boat crews that ended up down there. They ended up getting captured and they ended up getting questioned and then they ended up getting released. But let's be honest, there was a risk that they possibly wouldn't have even been able to leave. And then there's the aspect of how would it be possible for the U-boats to even survive in the Antarctic in the first place? You could easily make the argument that the Antarctic is practically impossible to be able to navigate with all the ice and stuff like that. And it's really difficult for regular ships to navigate it. And if anything, they can't even navigate it without icebreakers, let alone a submarine that, let's be honest, submarines are really, really fragile. Also, this was going on when Antarctica was going through their winter, which in turn, it would be almost impossible for them to be able to, I guess, submerge up and be able to look at the stars, which was very important to navigation in the first place, because essentially the stars would have been covered with the whole blizzard weather. And then there's the aspect that I have to mention again, that they would have to be able to breach the ice in order to, I guess, unload their cargo, which if they were trying to breach through really thick ice, I think their U-boat would have ended up getting destroyed. And then they would have to be able to navigate after they unloaded the U-boat, which, let's be honest, would be extremely hard to do. I mean, if anything, during the winter months nowadays, they actually have to stay inside for a good majority of the winter time there. So if, it's practically impossible for them nowadays to be able to go out in Antarctica outside, well, why in 1945 would they be able to, I guess, navigate and be able to leave the U-boat? Then there's the whole aspect of how would they get oxygen? Their, subs have to come up and fill the ship with oxygen. And I mean, you could say that they had CO2 scrubbers, but I have read somewhere, which I will actually be putting in this video, in the link, that pretty much it states that their CO2 scrubbers were unable to recycle the air. Um, and then also there's the aspect of, well, how would they be able to essentially get a huge fleet across the Atlantic without being caught at some point? I'm pretty sure a random Joe Blow like ship would be like, that doesn't look normal, and probably would want to know, okay, what's these ships doing here? Or eventually the ships would probably have to, I guess, come up for air, in which case they could have possibly been spotted by, I guess, people who were not really friendly towards them. So now let's look at the Operation High Jump part of this, and how I personally believe it wasn't necessarily an operation to go and defeat the Nazis. So essentially what Operation High Jump was it was a military operation that was conducted by the US from 1946 to 1947. It consisted of 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft, and it was led by Richard Bard. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. And what it was it was an operation to go to the Antarctic and possibly start a military base there, and also to test, I guess, the operational capabilities of our military in polar climates. If anything, it's kind of very similar to what's going on uh, in the Arctic today. And also, it dealt with the Soviets and how pretty much they were afraid that the Soviets were going to go and attack through Antarctica. Um, so I guess it was a way to checkpoint them. I said it's very similar to what's going on currently with the Arctic, and how essentially there's a new Cold War going on between the US and Russia, which is something really interesting to look into. But that's the reason why this whole thing was happening. Uh, Now, here's why I believe this narrative compared to the narrative that is brought by these conspiracy theorists. So, for starters, when the U.S. ships came back into port from their voyage, why has it, why had not none of the ships showed any signs of, I guess, battle damage in the form of artillery strikes to the ships? You would think if they were met with artillery that these ships would be damaged and they would have holes, and possibly a bunch of them would have sank, which none of them ended up sinking or actually getting damaged. The most that I'm aware of that did get damaged was a sub ended up basically smashing its hull on some ice, and it caused some damage to the ship. But other than that, there was no like other ships getting damaged. So I said, why wasn't there any artillery holes in the ships? The second thing is, well, why, with the exception of the four people that did die due to accidents, why wasn't there more basically casualties as a direct result of this? You would think if you were in an active military engagement, there would have been more casualties, and essentially more people would have died, or at the very least, there would have been some people wounded, which there was none reported. Um, Also, with that being said, with the combat, also would have came the stories from the people who were on it of being in combat. And there's actually people who ended up writing memoirs of this whole operation and pretty much what they did there. None of which showed any form of combat. They don't talk about combat at all. You would think that if you were getting shot at, it would be something that you would want to write in a book, which, as said, none of them have said that. Then there's in the books, and then there's the aspect of journalism. So there was 4 journalists present during this whole operation, none of which reported on, I guess, them finding the Nazi base, which I'm pretty sure they would have reported it. They would have been like, hey, there's Nazis down here, to the U.S. Citizens. Um, there's no way that they would be able to like not hide that. I mean, everybody would know that there's be Nazis there. And then also there's the aspect of, well, they mention how, I guess this is a travesty on history and how it's wrong that they're essentially hiding this. So that's really the question I have is, well, why would they hide it? Um, I think essentially it would be like the hugest thing in World War II it would be the fact that somehow some Nazis ended up surviving the conflict and ended up starting their own Arctic base. I mean, it would go crazy. Like everybody would know, or would, at the very least, it would be something that would be historical significant enough that they just wouldn't be able to hide it. There's no way that they would be ever to cover it up, or not able, but able to cover it up. So anyway, that's it for this week's video. I really appreciate the fact that you guys watched. Please like, subscribe, and share if you want. And I hope you guys are doing good. I'm personally doing good. I'm trying to, I guess, milk the last couple of days of summer before we get into, the fall weather. But I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of enjoying, looking forward to the fall. Um, I hope you guys have a good week and all that other stuff. Anyway, I'll be seeing you guys next week, and just remember, relax, chill, everything's gonna be okay.